The dead flight attendants on the plane were still manning the check-in desk and wandering around with their trolleys. There were all sorts of grudges and spirits in the cabin. What had happened to make this plane so strange? One of the airliners had been involved in a number of accidents for unknown reasons. Though the airline didn't want to phase it out, it had been refurbished, but the problems persisted. After the latest overhaul, it was resold to another airline. A construction issue occurred just before the flight, and it was being repaired. The Flight 47 from Bangkok to Phuket was taking off after a mechanical failure and was undergoing urgent repairs. Flight attendant Suni, who was serving on the flight, saw Flight 47 on the tarmac just before boarding and thought it looked familiar. Remembering his previous psychiatric clinic, the doctor suggested that his experience was a hallucination caused by overstressing. He had been in a plane crash, and it had taken him a while to adjust to the situation, but he had not been able to rejoin the plane and was now seeing Flight 47. Seeing Flight 47 in front of him, he couldn't help but think of his previous experience, said Mr. Ababan. The 7 flight was cleared for takeoff, and passengers began boarding the plane for the journey to Phuket. Everyone on board appeared to be relaxed and at ease. However, as Ben was passing under the plane, he heard a loud noise coming from the cargo compartment. Worried that something was wrong, he opened the door to check it out. After his inspection, as he was about to leave, he found that someone had already closed the door from the outside, and soon after, Flight 47 had taken off. A journey full of danger and fear began when the crew started preparing the passengers' meals, and the door suddenly failed to open. Suni's habit of knocking on the top of the cabinet door and then opening it instantly reminded her of a flight she had taken many years ago when the same problem was solved in the same way. Although the coincidence was frightening, Suni continued preparing the passengers' meals. As she squatted to retrieve utensils, she felt someone slowly turning their head behind her. Slowly, she turned her head and saw a horrible ghost. It disappeared quickly, leaving others puzzled. But Suni feared they were too scared to admit what they had just seen. Soon after, the plane entered a turbulence zone, and the crew instructed the passengers to remain seated. A bald man wandered around the cabin in a dazed state. When the cabin crew approached to stop him, bruises appeared on his face. He screamed and turned his head in a strange, unnatural way, revealing only the whites of his eyes. He then collapsed and fainted. The prince quickly checked his department, confirming that the man's head hadn't twisted off. At that moment, trapped Aban witnessed many horrible ghosts in the fire chamber. The captain noticed the pressure warning light flashing and ordered Deputy Pilot Cree to check the fire chamber. Cree found the trapped Aban and instructed him to go to Suni's side for help. Cree stayed in the fire chamber to continue his inspection, where he encountered 2 evil ghosts. The prince, noticing this, also reappeared. After the bald man's possession incident, the cabin atmosphere was grim. To ease the tension, the prince announced some happy news. A flight attendant and an engineer were about to be robbed of their faces. Amidst applause, Arban and Sunil entered. They were a couple. Sunil helped the injured Arban to his seat and returned to the work area. By this time, Flight 47 had lost its once new appearance, now covered in blood and in disrepair. The passengers reacted in unusual ways, screaming and twisting their bodies. Aban told Sunil to pressurize the cabin, urging the captain to turn on the oxygen system immediately. The captain, still flying Flight 47 in the southern region, continued operating the plane while ghosts covered the forward windscreen. When Sunil entered the cabin with oxygen masks, she found that all the passengers had passed out, and a dilapidated trolley was pushed by flight attendants. A broken-down food cart was wheeled out by a flight attendant still in charge of her duties. After Suni transferred the economy class passengers to the business class, where the pressure was normal. The Western travelers gradually recovered. After a series of strange events, the passengers were agitated. Ben explained to his host that the plane had descended too quickly, causing an imbalance in pressure and hallucinations. When he was about to enter the cockpit, Suni reminded him that the door could not be opened, and no one had responded to the passengers. The oxygen masks the passengers were using did not last long. Eventually, Ben and Suni headed to the fire deck to repair the pressure system. Meanwhile, Aban and Suni went to the cabin to fix the system, finding the area in the same disrepair it had been in during the accident many years ago. On the other side, a passenger named Gil, who had been accepted by Cambridge University but whose passion for flying was sparked by a model airplane gifted by his father as a child, decided to enroll in aviation school. Veda held her distraught daughter in her arms, promising she would be safe. In that moment of danger, Gil took the opportunity to tell her mother that she wanted to give up her Cambridge admission and pursue aviation instead. Her mother, who was sitting in the front row, overheard this and, surprisingly, instead of her usual disapproving attitude, told her daughter to shut up. She had grown tired of the constant pressure from her wife. Just then, a birthday song began playing in the cabin, and once again the old trolley appeared with damaged cakes on it, horrifying the passengers. When the song stopped, a thieving cat bravely stepped forward to push the trolley away. Just as everyone thought the situation was under control, a passenger named Siuan suddenly began acting strangely, as if possessed by a ghost. He started speaking in voices, asking where Suni was, but no one answered. Gil's mother remembered what the ghost had said and began screaming for Suni, claiming that since she had abandoned them, she would now have to die along with everyone else. Suni, who was sitting on the floor, had seen the ghosts before collapsing. Oxygen levels in the cabin were rapidly depleting, and some passengers had already fainted. The pressure system on Flight 47 had been successfully repaired by Aban, and the flight resumed normal operations. Passengers were slowly regaining consciousness, but one elderly lady had died from oxygen deprivation. Though the ghosts on Sayuan had left, the rest of the passengers were still terrified. At this point, Ben and Suni returned to the cabin. They needed to find a way to break into the cockpit to figure out what was happening inside. Gil's mother, recalling the words of the ghosts, approached Suni to ask her what had happened, and why the ghosts were trying to get into the cabin. When he tried to get a closer look, he saw the markings of the year of death again. She approached Sunil and asked him what had happened in the past and why these ghosts were trying to kill them. Sunil hadn't answered yet, but the monk beside him began to explain. He said that although these spirits had the power to convert themselves into electromagnetic waves, making them unable to directly harm humans, they were still connected to this flight through a specific grudge. Jim, not wanting to get into the complexities of science, believed that the root of the problem was Suni. For everyone's safety, he suggested they all stay in the back of the cabin. As the situation worsened, the flight attendant Prince called for Ben. When Ben returned to the cabin, he saw Suni preparing to leave, and he realized what was happening. Jim, along with the other passengers, began to beg Suni to stay away, believing she was the cause of the danger. Ben, knowing he couldn't change their minds, asked Suni to leave the cabin. Reluctantly, she did. However, as soon as they entered the economy class, they heard piercing screams of ghosts. They were forced to retreat back to the business class, but by then, strange occurrences had begun there as well. Loud pounding could be heard outside the aircraft, and the lights inside the cabin had gone completely dark. Fortunately, the pressure system remained unaffected, and when the terrifying cries of the ghosts finally subsided, Prince asked Suni to explain what had happened. Suni began telling her story. 10 years ago, shortly after she had started her career, she experienced a tragic catastrophe. At that time, all the passengers aboard seemed to descend into madness. She was the only survivor of the incident. Now, the plane they were currently flying on was the same one involved in that accident. Suni reached for a flashlight and shone it on the cockpit door, revealing diagonal scratches. As she moved closer, she realized they were from the fingernails of the passengers who had died that year, scratching desperately for help. At that moment, a middle-aged man, upon realizing this horrifying truth, screamed in fear and fled to the back of the cabin. The selfishness of human nature was laid bare. No matter the prior relationships between the passengers, everyone was now solely focused on their own survival. Little Anne, who had been left behind, kept pleading for help. The cat turned back, embraced Little Anne, and began laughing maniacally. Shocked, the cat released Little Anne and shoved him aside. At that moment, the ghost possessed Siuan again, and he began to dance a traditional Thai dance in front of the cat. The cat, apologizing to him, punched him, knocking him down. In a frenzy, the cat grabbed a fire extinguisher and mercilessly smashed it into Siuan's head repeatedly until he lay cold and lifeless, no longer moving. Meanwhile, a couple in the restroom faced a chaotic scene of banging and threats outside. They recalled witnessing the fire extinguisher being used to break down a door earlier. That same fire extinguisher was now being wielded by a ghostly force, ready to destroy once again. When the three men followed Sunil's example, they stood still and closed their eyes. However, in their stillness, one of them accidentally hit a man on the head, causing him to collapse and faint. His body fell heavily onto his wife. Blowhard quickly stepped forward to pull him away from her, but the man had already suffered serious injuries and tragically passed away. At this point, they realized that Jill had disappeared. Ben speculated that she might have gone to the fire compartment, so he led Suni and the others there. Ben asked Suni how she had extinguished the fire the last time, but Suni's memory was blurred. She only remembered closing her eyes and allowing the ghosts to surround her until they reached a corner of the plane. Meanwhile, Jim heard the cries of a hawk and, along with the monk, went into the cabin to search for the old lady. As they passed what seemed to be her corpse, the old woman suddenly came back to life, causing them both to scream in terror. When she lunged at them, Shang immediately ducked and fled, leaving Jim behind. The old lady caught Jim, and he desperately called out to Shang for help. The dead woman opened her mouth, and a swarm of flies poured out. Shang sat in his seat, clasped his hands together, and began praying. However, he soon realized the ghosts around him were losing their calm. He fell to the ground, horrified to find that the entire cabin was filled with ghosts of different shapes and forms. Yoshiki stood up, found a wrecked cart nearby, and quickly pushed it, striking the ghostly old woman. The monk, who still had his eyes closed in fear, appeared to Yoshiki as a ghost as well. In the warehouse, a different crisis unfolded. A few people searching for an old love were confronted by the ghost of a long-deceased air hostess, who had once been their CO worker. Kimeki, having gone mad and now considering all men as enemies, grabbed a bottle of wine. She smashed it and struck down the wife of the West, then stabbed Prince with the broken bottle. The prince backed away in terror, unaware that, in Kimeki's eyes, he too was a ghost. Believing she was surrounded by enemies, Kimeki jumped into the firehouse. Meanwhile, the cowardly Chad opened his eyes too early, against the advice he had been given. Seeing a ghost, he grabbed an axe from the toolbox, thinking it would protect him. As the ghost approached, Chad swung the axe, despite his companions shouting to dissuade him. Just then, the prince arrived. With one powerful swing, Blowhard cleaved the ghost in two, killing it on the spot. Blowhard tried to explain to his master what had happened, but Veda questioned whether he had used the ghost as an excuse to kill innocent people. Suni defended herself, arguing that this had been the same pattern during the last chase. They were all killing each other. When they returned to the cabin, it was already occupied by ghostly spirits. As they walked cautiously through the room, they could feel the anger of those who had been killed by Blowhard, restless in their ghostly forms. In the midst of their terror, they arrived at the cabin, and at the doorway stood a long-dead air hostess. Bomba, mistaking her for a ghost, closed her eyes and rushed toward her, only to have her hand pass right through the body. It turned out that the figure was actually Jem's mother, who had been possessed. The rest of the group quickly built a makeshift stake and returned to the cabin. However, the ghosts of the air hostesses followed them down the stairs, relentlessly chasing them. The group, determined to break the spirits of the ghosts, began to laugh and challenge them. They believed that even if they were killed and turned into ghosts, they could fight back. This fearless attitude weakened the ghosts, who, sensing a lack of fear, lost their power and began to disperse into thin air. When they returned to the cabin, they found Jill, who had been missing, and all the ghosts were gone. The couple, overjoyed at their reunion, embraced each other. However, the danger was not over. Hidden behind a bottle, a halberd had yet to be removed. As they tried to open the cockpit door, they discovered that the front windshield was covered in ghosts. With no other option, they retreated back to the cabin. At that moment, Jim, who had just broken free from his restraints, rushed at them with an axe in hand. Though he had lost his senses, he still recognized his daughter. Jim warned her husband, Werder, that he had turned into an evil spirit and posed a threat to their daughter. In a moment of desperation, Werder, who had fallen to the ground, picked up a sharp weapon and stabbed his wife in the neck. As this chaos unfolded, the unmanned plane began to plummet. Ben quickly entered the cockpit and did everything he could to restore the plane's trajectory. Meanwhile, food carts in the passenger compartment burst open during the downward spiral, and 4 pieces of cutlery flew across the room, stabbing into Jem's body. The movie then flashes back, revealing a long-lost truth. Suni, after being persuaded by Ben, finally confessed the truth of what had happened 10 years ago. She had been the one who blocked the cockpit door during the earlier tragedy. Despite the desperate pleas of her colleagues outside and their attempts to force their way in, she had held the door shut, ultimately sealing their fate. This action had caused their resentment to linger, turning them into vengeful spirits. When Ben appeared on the plane again, the same spirits returned, filled with rage. As the plane neared the ground, Ben returned to the cockpit. The altitude was now dangerously low, and despite not being able to call his colleagues on the ground, he managed to guide the plane to a safe landing. The ghosts of those who had died in the earlier accident clung to the landing gear, but with Ben's efforts, the gear deployed and the plane landed smoothly at the airport. As Ben and Veda disembarked from the plane, Suni stayed behind. The last 3 survivors boarded an ambulance, but Suni, burdened by guilt and the sins she had committed, ultimately met her fate. Whether she was dead or not remained ambiguous. The movie ends with a chilling note. The plane, still haunted by years of unresolved grudges, would take to the skies once again after being refurbished, leaving the audience in suspense,